Nailing Through History presents Shays Rebellion.
War is coming, you can see the warning. You better run, drop, take stock. You try to do right, to shine without light. You're gonna run, drop, take stock. You got to push on, roll deep, roll strong.
The January 6th insurrection was an event which stunned people across the country. However, it was not the first time citizens of the United States had ever risen up against any of their political leaders. Following the American Revolution, the merchants of Massachusetts found themselves in an economic crisis as their European business partners refused to extend lines of credit and demanded payments in hard currency from the former British colony. The problem faced by these large coastal merchants was that the customers they sold goods to were small local merchants who often bartered with the farmers. As a result, the value of the payments varied depending on the growing season. With the coastal merchants demanding their customers pay in hard currency, local merchants began to do the same with their farmer customers. In addition to the merchants who were making these demands, tax collectors and banks were also demanding the repayment of debts, leading some farmers to lose their homes and land for failing to pay. John Hancock, who was governor at the time, opted to resign by citing health concerns. However, some historians believe Hancock saw that something bad was coming and did not want to find himself getting caught in the middle of it. With his resignation, an election had to be held, and a new governor, James Bowdoin, was elected and began to push for the collection of back taxes. In addition to this, he also pushed for the legislature to add an additional property tax in order to help pay foreign debts. For the farmers and rural people who were suffering under all these new taxes, they found the only way they could try to find some type of ease of their suffering was with the issuing of paper money. However, there was a problem. The newly elected governor and other Eastern legislators refused to allow this, as it would mean they would lose money, and as such, it seemed that the power of money and greed was ruling the day.
Feel the first crack, you land on your back. Run, drop, take stock. The poison burns deep, the poison don't sleep. You're gonna run, drop, fight the clock.
Sensing there was danger from all the unrest, which was beginning to be aroused throughout the state, Governor Bowdoin did not send military forces out initially to deal with the protesters. Instead, he condemned the actions and then put in different safety measures to ensure that in the event of future protests, the local militias could be called out to put these down. To further complicate matters, though, neighboring states were also beginning to deal with this very same issue from their farmers. However, unlike Massachusetts, other states soon found their legislatures filled with government officials who sympathized with the farmers and would therefore issue paper money and force merchants to accept the devaluation of currency in order to pay debts. While Bowdoin was not wanting to do this, he was pushing for the courts in Massachusetts to begin prosecuting the leaders of these different protests, which were beginning to borderline on rebellions. He did soon discover, though, that trying to get these trials to go underway were extremely difficult in the West, as protesters were able to disrupt the trials and prevent them from going forward. As you go further east through Massachusetts, however, trials were proven to be successful, as militias who were pro-government were being called out to protect the courthouses. As such, it was only the eastern courthouses which were able to stay open. One individual who made himself have an opinion which was seen as rather controversial was Samuel Adams, who would propose the extreme measure of executing those who were rebelling against the Republic. The Massachusetts legislature, in order to attempt to quell the protest, passed a bill allowing for old debts to be paid in goods rather than hard money. In addition to this, however, they would also pass measures which would prohibit speech which was critical of the government. As such, the protest did not cease, and the citizens of Massachusetts became increasingly alarmed when they learned that the status of habeas corpus was being suspended. As such, arrests of protest leaders began to go forward in the East, and for farmers in the West, this was a call for action. One of those farmers was a man by the name of Daniel Shays. He, along with other Western leaders, began to organize their supporters and decided they would need to overthrow the state government if there was ever going to be order in Massachusetts.
All your big dreams, you fool, you can't see. There's no time to look back. There's no time to look back.
Having gathered the militia, Daniel Shays, a veteran of the American Revolution, and other leaders of the rebellion, devised a plan to take the Springfield Armory in order to have more weapons and ammunition for their rebellion as they moved east. While they lacked a significant size and numbers in the western portion of Massachusetts, they were confident that as they moved further east towards Boston, more citizens would join their cause and effectively make their force large enough to overwhelm any pro-government militia that could be formed. The proposed attack on the Springfield Armory was a simple one. Shays' militia rebellion force would divide itself into 3 different groups. Approaching the armory from 3 different directions, they could surround it, overwhelm the garrison there, and then move on. Unbeknownst to Shays, one force was unable to arrive, and as such, this would only leave a smaller group of rebels arriving. To further complicate things, Shays was expecting a small garrison force, but instead discovered that there was a well-prepared militia standing guard at the armory. This government-led militia was commanded by General William Shepard, also a veteran of the American Revolution. And unlike the rebels, Shepard had something rather unique: 2 cannons. Having loaded his cannon with grape shot, Shepard would fire upon the rebels, killing 4 of them and wounding another 20. No muskets were fired during this conflict, and just as quickly as Shays' force showed up, they just as quickly disappeared. It did not take long for the rebels to discover that a pro-government militia force of 3,000 men were marching towards their position. They were being led by General Benjamin Lincoln, a man famous for having accepted the surrender of General Lord Cornwallis at the Battle of Yorktown. As Lincoln began marching, it was clear that the rebels had to put as much distance between themselves and this pro-government faction. As such, they kept moving their army, or at least what was left of it, further into the northern portions of Massachusetts, getting closer to the border with Vermont. In order to ensure that this rebellion could be crushed as quickly as possible, Benjamin Lincoln would surprise the rebel force by forcing his men to march through a snowstorm in the middle of the night. Not realizing what was happening, Lincoln's army was able to overwhelm the defenses of the rebel force and capture 150 men. Sadly for Lincoln, his success was almost complete until they discovered that the ringleaders of the rebellion were able to escape and get off into the Vermont frontier. What few forces were left of the rebels rallied together and would move to Sheffield, Massachusetts, where they would be engaged in the bloodiest conflict of the rebellion, which would see 30 rebels killed and the remnants of the force captured.
All your big dreams, you fool, you can't see. It's gonna slip away now. It's gonna slip away now.
Following the rebellion, amnesty was granted to those who acknowledged their part in Shays Rebellion. The Massachusetts state legislature did not realize just how many people were part of it until 4,000 citizens came forward to acknowledge that they had, in some small part, a role in the rebellion. 18 of these men were convicted of their crimes during this time period and sentenced to death, but their punishments were otherwise commuted, overturned, or even pardoned. Part of the reason for this was the re-election of John Hancock as governor of Massachusetts. For Daniel Shays, he was pardoned of his crimes in 1788, but was unable to stay in his home state of Massachusetts due to the fact that he was villainized by the state press. Instead, he would move to New York and died a poor and almost forgotten man in 1825. One group of people who greatly benefited from Shays' Rebellion were the people of Vermont. At this point in time, Vermont was not an independent state, but rather part of New York. Always having a rebellious streak within them, the people of Vermont had always desired to be independent. As such, for the New York State Legislature, seeing the number of rebels who were coming in from Massachusetts during this Shays' Rebellion, took it upon themselves to take advantage of the situation and grant Vermont its independence. Their logic was, we no longer have to deal with this rather troublesome group of people. For the people of Vermont, they would become citizens of the 14th state of the Union. The rebellion also proved to be the catalyst for the need to create a new form of government. Everyone agreed the Articles of Confederation was no longer working in the United States, and as such, 1787 would see the creation of a constitutional convention. This convention would last for 3 months and brought together many notable figures in American history. At the convention, the memory of Shays' Rebellion was exceedingly influential. In one area, its influence was found to be most prominent when it came to the election of legislators. There were those members of the convention who were very fearful of the idea of having a democracy, and that if we had a pure democracy, this could create trouble. Instead, the members of the Constitutional Convention had settled the idea that the United States was a republic with some democratic tendencies. As such, in creating the House of Representatives, it was decided that this chamber would be elected by the people. But when it came to the Senate, it would be the state legislature which would decide who would represent each state for that particular body. Another issue which was brought up through Shays' Rebellion was the issue of having to pay back foreign debt. Individual states were responsible for doing this. However, through the Constitutional Convention and later in the presidency of George Washington, it would be Alexander Hamilton who would establish the Bank of the United States and a method of paying back the debts owed by this country to their European allies from the American Revolution. With the creation of the Constitution, a new form of government was going to be put into place for the nation. However, citizens of the United States were uncertain as to exactly how good the Constitution really was. Everyone had thought the Articles of Confederation was going to work, so how could they be assured that this particular document, the Constitution, was actually going to be a successful one? Nobody knew. However, it would not take very long for the Constitution to be tested, and over the span of 250 30 plus years, it has been repeatedly tested, and every time the Constitution has been able to stand up to all of its challenges. A few changes have been made, but even with those changes added on to it, the Constitution has proven to be able to weather all storms, no matter how big or small they could ever be.
Got to push on, roll deep, roll strong, till the knife at your throat feels like home.
For more information, please consider these suggested titles. Be sure to click on the left-hand side of the screen to subscribe to our show, and on the right-hand side for our latest episode. And we will see you again for the next episode of Milling Through History.